Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of American Petroleum Professionals of Iranian Heritage, APPIH, it's our great honor to start another webinar on the subject of reservoir rock and fluid heterogeneities and variabilities, impact on recovery mechanism by Dr. Matt Honarpour. Dr. Honarpour is a principal reservoir engineer at BHP Corporation in Houston. He has contributed significantly to the understanding of rock fluid interactions and integration, spatial core analysis, miscible CO2 process, and scale-up of multi-phase flow properties. Dr. Honarpour has significant work experience with the different major operating companies, as well as professorship at University of Montana. Dr. Honarpour awarded many times. Would you please unmute yourself, person?
Okay.
Dr. Honarpour awarded many times, and for saving the time, only I mentioned two remarkable one.
I don't think it's on my side.
I don't know. It's not either from my side as well. I don't know.
Okay. So,
okay, sorry. I'm very sorry. Dr. Honarpour awarded many times, and for saving time, only I mentioned two remarkable ones. First, Lifetime Achievement Award in 2000 of Society of Core Analysis, SCAA, of Society and Society of Petroleum Engineering, SPE, Formation Evaluation Award in 2011. He has more than 100 technical papers and 3 books in reservoir engineering, reservoir characterization, and relative permeability. I would like to thank Dr. Honarpour for accepting our invitation, and without further delay, I'm transferring microphone to him for starting his presentation. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. Does everybody hear me?
I think so. I think
okay.
So, everybody.
Well, greeting to all of you. First of all, my sincere thanks to Mr. or Dr. Hamid Reza for arranging this meeting, and APPIH for organizing this event and a similar webinar, which is, I think it's very positive. This painting that I am showing, it really shows the birth of petroleum industry, where you see the main mode of transportation was horses. And then in background, you see the rigs with probably 100 feet distance between them. And on the very corner, on the bottom left, you see a 1908 Model T that Henry Ford introduced into the market for versatility, cost that people can afford, and the little note you see on the bottom, 20 horsepower. Now, the Tesla these days has up to 800 horsepower. So you could see where we've come from. And we still see the horses as in some of the rural America and the rest of the world that as one mode of transportation. So even after 100 years, we could see that other mode of transportation doesn't disappear. And so as situation that we are in now, there is a new electrification and electric cars and all that. And it takes a long time in order to become dominant and integrate. All right. Then we go back to the top title of my presentation, Reservoir Rock and Fluid Heterogeneities and Variability, Impact on Recovery Process. I want you to recognize that heterogeneities and variabilities are two different issues. Variability, like you have viscosity changing with depth in the reservoir, or porosity reduces with depth as the net effect of overburden pressure or stress increases. These are variability that should be distinguished from heterogeneity. Heterogeneity is all of a sudden a process or results appear that is unlike the trend. Like, a zone that has a lot of bugs in it, or high clay content, or high residual oil saturation. So there is a geological factor behind it. And there are reservoir engineering factors like wettability changes or relative permeability changes. So these are heterogeneities causing from rock property changes and rock fluid property changes. So this is a little bit of a long slide, but the issue of a lot of these heterogeneities are handled through net to growth ratio or factor or multiplier that reservoir engineers use it without really knowing the pattern of these net to growth. And it's very important to characterize these patterns, identify these heterogeneities and variabilities, and then after integration, you do some integration with compressibility, rock compressibility, and relative perm, and other things. These are at all of them at the pore and core level. You also integrate these data with information at bed scale level and larger scale using IPTT, PTA, RTA, VSP, and some of the new seismic properties, ocean bottom node that is come to get all of these included into your reservoir model. So this is important message that I want to pass to you, that just petrophysicists put a net to growth and reservoir engineering to use multiplier. And we need to pay attention to what these are and where they are. And I'm just showing an image on the right-hand side, that this image shows some of the heterogeneities and the properties of the rock. These are basically coming from a core. 3 feet, every 3 feet are lined together, and shows the remaining oil saturation. And some of the high visibility remaining oil saturation is because of the presence of heterogeneities. I'm going to go over it later, but these heterogeneities cause lots of oil left behind from an assumption that we use in the laboratory, use a uniform log, very homogeneous for testing. So it really doesn't represent the reservoir in the full scale. So I think this is the message, and I see if I can move this a little bit out of the picture. So heterogeneous must be identified, quantified, distributed, and scaled up in simulation model for decision making on well placement and recovery factor. This is from the reservoir engineer point of view. Here's an example of almost a foot long or 6 inches long valvular carbonate from a reservoir called Arun in Aceh province in Indonesia. And I took this 1 foot long or 6 inch long that you could see a lot of vugs in there. These vugs, variation of these vugs, distribution of these vugs, are heterogeneities. I wanted to see really what is the variability, what is the variation of permeability properties. So I measured whole core permeability in this rock was about 110 millidarcy. And it's shown by this line, you can show by this black double arrow line, that shows the permeability of 110 millidarcy that I measured. Then I took mini permeametry, and mini permeametry shows with this red pattern. So you could see the many permeability shows permeability about 15 millidarcy to all the way to 120 millidarcy. This is the variability, and taking some core plugs, very closely spaced core plug, you could see it measured about 30 millidarcy, 40 millidarcy, 80 millidarcy. There is no way by addition of these, averaging of these, you can come up with the permeability of the full diameter core. So basically, averaging permeability may not agree with the data from full diameter, particularly in carbonate rocks. So this is the challenge of upscaling. You need to know the details of the rock properties. And another example is I did the calculation or measurement of the critical condensate saturation in these rocks. And it shows that it's a function of the saturation, which is the amount of vugs that exist in here, rather than the matrix that is surrounding it. So it is very important to characterize the heterogeneity and their impact on flow. This is from a reservoir in Qatar, a major gas reservoir, North Field. And here is, I measured the permeability in that plug, assuming a homogeneous assumption, was about 380 millidarcy. But from the CT scan, you could see there's two rock types together. One being a little bit whitish, which is the more hard rock, less permeable, and darker one is much more permeable. So in here, I did the saturation and subtracted from dry patterns, CT scan from the wet, and calculated and measured permeability. I found out that there is on the right, lower right is as high as 800 millidarcy, and up here is 390 millidarcy. So there is a significant variation even in the core plug. So you can average these. These are properties that are directionally dependent. You just can't average them like that. So heterogeneity in core plug shown by CT density and permeability in this case. Now we go to the pore-level properties. And here is the new high-resolution CT scan of the grains in these very deep water rocks, about 32,000 feet. And then net confining stress, you could see how the rock properties becomes almost very low. And so as each of these grains have different properties, different mineralogy, different property, and maybe even different weathability. So the flow through these are much more complex than just one number to represent all of these, even at the pore level that you could see here. So grain size distribution, micron scale resolution, that's what you see, throat size and corresponding variation of weathability is a challenge, because you just can't represent this whole rock with one number. And should we display weathability as a distribution? This is something that I worked with in Grain and Halliburton on this issue. So you could see now the carbonate, something we need to understand, that carbonate are kinetically and thermally unstable. Unstable mineralogy is therefore is susceptible very much to mechanical properties and chemical alteration. They have high organic content and deposition, which is byproduct of organism, interbedded with organically rich phases. So all of these properties make it very difficult to characterize these reservoirs, because it's really a lot variability and heterogeneity in various properties, porosity permeabilities, surface properties, which is implication to weathability, and causing the transition zone or even remaining oil saturation below the contact. So all of these need to be captured in a reservoir simulation that we do to study these reservoirs. And the challenge is some of these properties you characterize at pore level or micron, and then has to be integrated and scaled up to core level, and then basically well level and reservoir level. And this is challenge of reservoir engineers these days. And so this is example of a couple of fields that ConocoPhillips measured remaining oil saturation in carbonate reservoir, 108 samples, 20 reservoirs, and sandstones, 316 samples, 75 reservoir. You could see there is a residual oil saturation from 5% to 40%. And so as in here to 50%, these are variation of the oil that is going to be left behind in these reservoir rocks. And so it has a major impact. How do you like that a giant reservoir, 1 billion barrels of in place, or 2 billion barrels, up to 40, 50% of the oil you leave behind? And so this is the challenge of reservoir engineer and geologists or geoscientists to characterize these reservoirs better. And then this is an interesting thing. This is Seminole Formation in West Texas. And this is the vertical well. This is the bottom part of it. That's 5,550 feet. And the top of this zone is around 5,300 feet below the surface. Okay, these are the depth. So Mother Nature has water flooded this reservoir. Why? Because there has been some structural change. The reservoir shifted. As a result, aquifer has moved about 250 feet above the original water oil contact. And here it shows the original water oil contact. You can see at original water oil contact, around 5550, oil saturation is 0, basically. That means that was the original paleo oil water contact. And then as water moved into the reservoir, variation of a remaining oil saturation is all the way from 20% to about 50%. And you could see some places 20, some places 30, 40, 50, 60. So one number, residual oil saturation, doesn't represent this type of situation. This is, even though Mother Nature, but the water has moved in a very stable manner. So the variability in remaining oil saturation is because of the pore-level heterogeneities and core-level heterogeneities. And if you don't characterize this type of heterogeneities and relate it to the properties, you're not getting a representative performance. So this is the paper we published some time ago. And in fact, Professor Kazemi uses this for demonstration in a senior class to see how properties varies. And he worked on this field long time ago. All right. So our understanding of wettability used to be this image on the left, which is basically in a strongly water wet system, assuming all the pore walls are water wet, and then there is oil in the middle that flows. Later on, this is the conceptual wettability that, when the surface of the rock in here, it comes in contact with the oil, the rest of the corner and crevices are strongly water wet. So you got a portion that is oil wet, portion that is water wet, and then you call this mixed wet. And sometimes the rock doesn't have tendency to neither oil or water. And we call that intermediate. So the wettability, we try to present it with one number, and in some studies that is represented some of the reservoir with one number is this technique, what US Bureau of Mine technique, which uses centrifuge work, and the centrifuge work provide work needed to displace water, and then work needed to displace oil, and the ratio of the log of this is called by an index between -1 and +1. So depending on a strongly water wet to a strongly oil wet. The problem is majority of the reservoir is in the middle in here, around minus 0.1, 0.2 to plus 1.12. Again, it does not represent true picture of the variability at the pore level or core level. Now, this is the technique that I just mentioned. You measure capillary pressure using centrifuge method, primary drainage or secondary drainage, and then imbibition, and the area under the primary or secondary drainage and area under the primary imbibition, you get the ratio, and that represents the variability. All right. So this is going back to the capillary pressure. You could see we measure capillary pressure, and then why do we need capillary pressure measurement? Capillary pressure measurement, we try to determine the water saturation in the core in the reservoir condition. And the water saturation in the core is controlled by capillary pressure. And so we can measure cores. This is the core from deepwater Gulf of Mexico, 25,000 feet. And you could see it's very uniform. The core is very uniform. And of course, you see all the heterogeneities that should be characterized. What we measure capillary pressure and the water saturation from the what we call cores that is taken with the water-based mud that is not added to the remaining oil. And we got a good way of characterizing. You could see this is very important because that helps determine the remaining oil saturation in the reservoir and oil in place. And this was, you could see that most of the reservoirs had about 20-25%. This reservoir had 20-25% initial water saturation. So supposed to be very uniform rock, but there is a lot of variability in it. And now so we've talked about the distribution of the water, remaining oil saturation and initial water saturation in a water flood type of situation. Now I want to show you an example of the gravity drainage gas injection. This is very interesting thing because, here is a reservoir, giant reservoir named Ubet in JV joint venture area in Nigeria, offshore. And it's sandstone, a very high quality rock. In fact, the name Ubet means lion in the local language. The operators name a lot of their reservoirs after type of fish in the offshore or type of animals in the area. And so this is Ubet, you could see, is a giant sandstone reservoir, black oil, and then offshore Nigeria. The reservoir consists of two flanks. The two flanks are connected together, and it is the western part is prograding shallow marine system. Eastern is disturbed. The same formation, but is disturbed, extensive slumps for that, what they call very small faults. So when you have a lot of small faults, gas injection is short-circuited. So the gas moves through these slumps without displacing the oil in a stable fashion. So we took cores from all the way from 5740, and you could see that is in here, the first column, 1, 2, 3, is one core 3 foot long. And then you could see is under UV light, there is no fluorescence. That means there is no oil in it. Of course, fluorescence for detection of oil, it's the uncertainty is 1 or 2% uncertainty. So, but we see basically no fluorescence in the first 3 feet. The next 3 feet, which is the second column, 4, 5, 6. Again, you don't see any fluorescence, nor you see anything in 7, 8, 9, and 10, 11, 12. So this is the original gas cap in the reservoir. The original gas cap, it shows no oil in it. As I said, uncertainty is 1 or 2%. But over 50 million years, the oil from the part of the reservoir, because of the depressurization, has basically swept and in a stable fashion moved down. All right. Then in core 18, which is about 21 feet, 18 feet down, the first fluorescence appears, which is in core number 18, 19, 20, there is a small amount of oil you could see under fluorescence. And then as you go look at it further, this is a basically secondary gas cap that we injected gas, and it actually did the displacement and left larger oil behind. And you could see in a core, like, in a 5771, significant oil is left behind. So as in 5772 and 5770, there is a distribution of remaining oil. So this concept that we get a constant residual oil in the reservoir, even very uniform, this is 1,000 millidarcy rock, and relatively closer to water wet, you could see heterogeneity controlled and basically impacted significant of oil remaining behind. And this is extremely important. We quantify this. What is left behind? The average is about 6%. But if you don't know the distribution of it, the way that these remaining oil saturation are distributed, it's very difficult to come up with the recovery process that remains this huge oil that is left behind. So let's go look at it further. This is further down. This is the original oil that is 60 to 75% oil left in here, SOI. And there are zones that you see, like at 5786, there is a lot of heterogeneities. 5800, 5801, there is a lot. 5800, you could see there is a lot of remaining oil saturation. So nobody studied this. What is controlling this part of the rock that is not swept properly? Can we come up with a recovery mechanism to do this, even though in this very stable gravity drainage process, we couldn't get this remaining oil saturation to be very low. So the point is that even though gravity drainage is an efficient gas displacement process, but certain criteria need to be present to take place. First of all, you should have vertical permeability lower than horizontal. Otherwise, the gas, injected gas, channeled through the system, and you won't be able to displace any oil. And then fractures, slumps, those are things are not suitable for reservoirs that you want to go on a gravity drainage. Reservoir simulation grid block should be very small. You could see in here, what size of the grid block do you need in order to capture these heterogeneity? Probably less than 1 foot. And then, of course, to be able to see that, you should do that. And then you need to have oil relative permeability, oil water relative permeability properly scaled to handle these variation for different type of reservoirs. All right, so this is the reservoir that I was talking about, gravity drainage. First of all, we did place horizontal well because the permeability, vertical permeability, was not too far lower than a horizontal permeability. Therefore, even though this is unconsolidated rocks or very friable, we managed to put a horizontal well, about 100 feet, 120 feet of horizontal well. And then initial production was, you could see, was around 20 to 30,000 barrels a day. Was 30,000 barrels per day. And then putting a horizontal well and applying the gravity drainage, it turned out we increased the production to about 80, 90, 100,000 barrels a day. That's the managing these reservoirs, capturing the heterogeneities. And you could see the plateau production in the figure on the right increased by several years. And overall performance was very good. And then relative permeability had to be modified in order to capture the effect of the gravity drainage in a low oil saturation, the oil relative permeability. Oil relative permeability was 10 to the minus 4 to 10 to the minus 5 in order to reach the residual oil saturation that we had in the core. We monitor in the core. So you could see there is a lot of knowledge and data need to be collected and integrated in order to be able to model these reservoirs. As I mentioned earlier, this reservoir, UBET, had a west flank and east flank. The east flank, I think the west flank did perfectly. Gravity drainage applied. The east flank, the gravity drainage was miserably failure. Why? Because there was a lot of micro faults as a result of the slumps. And gas expansion under drawdown that the horizontal well was experiencing caused the gas to funnel through the fractures or faults and then break into the wells with a very little displacement. So knowledge of these microfaults that geologists need to characterize and distribute it in the reservoir model are extremely important. All right, so now these days there's a lot of talk about the imaging for application of lattice Boltzmann for calculation of properties. And here's two examples in the literature is that they've used this technology to determine. You could see on figure A is actual rock properties that you could see the permeability, different, red being high, green being low, and then scaled up in figure B that we did the modeling, and you could see the variation of permeability of from a pore imaging, very different from a lab measured properties. So this is because we don't know how to scale up the properties yet. And that's an area that we can use a lot of research. And I think that is the end of my talk. Be happy to entertain any question you have or any challenges that you like to learn more about or related to research that you're doing. Anyway, I would like to ask Dr. Hamid to facilitate that if possible.
Thank you so much, Dr. Honarpour. It's very interesting that I did not expect such a heterogeneity in the system. It's very interesting. And for the audience, if you like, you can write down your question in the chat box, or if you like, you can raise your hand and then we will let you unmute yourself and ask the question. First question came from the Dr. Mahmoud Khani. He asked, can we get list of the papers that Dr. Honarpour mentioned in his presentation?
I'll be happy to send you some of the papers that are published, all of them, and then you certainly can you know, a lot of them are SPE published.
Nice.
And be happy. I can directly, if I know your email and email address, you send me a note, I'll be happy to send it.
Also, he asked, what would be a difference between horizontal and vertical permeabilities of gas flooding versus water flooding?
Well, the vertical permeability in the gas flood is much more, has significant effect, more than the effect on water flooding. Because of the water having a higher density, gravity always tries to keep it down. So as the pressure increases, water moves up in the reservoir in a very stable way, much more stable than the gas from the gas cap. Gas cap, you know, if you have a strong gas cap, secondary gas cap, or primary gas cap, and you put a well even horizontal, you got to prepare yourself for recompletion of the zones that gas come out, and it's not easy to do that in a horizontal well. In vertical well, you could do that, but you know, all of these should be modeled and see how much it can be managed, or you can come with a innovative technique in order to shut off the zones that is causing the gas to break through. In these days, you know, they can do that. It can see multiple completion, and then some of them can be bypassed because that gas breakthrough is the enemy of the displacement process by gas.
Okay. Next question, what is the best approach for the lab evaluation to account for heterogeneity in reservoir?
Well, that's a very good question. Certainly, heterogeneity at the pore level, it then can be characterized in a standard small cores, 1.5 inch diameter, and then imaging. But then I designed some apparatus that could handle core 4.5 inch diameter and up to 7 feet tall. And I published some results. I mean, particularly in the case of gas flood, you need core that has longer and larger diameter. So you see the end effect and capillary continuity to be accounted for. And this was one experiment that I had to do in one of the reservoirs in the Middle East that has been a significant amount of oil trapped below the current contact, halio contact. So example is a reservoir that part of it is in the Persian Gulf of Iran, and part of it is in the Qatari's water. In both of them, there is a remaining oil saturation of 50–60% below the water oil contact. And again, by the Mother Nature water flood, that has happened. And so the question is, what do you do to see if this oil that is trapped, I mean, gas that is trapped, it's a gas reservoir, I'm sorry, gas condensate reservoir, with about 30–40 barrels per million. What does it take to be able to release this trapped gas saturation? So I designed an equipment that it was with a large diameter core, and we did the first process the gas in water movement in the reservoir and trapping the gas, and the trapped gas saturation was around 50–60%, because most of in some of the rocks, which is moldy limestone. So then have to reduce the pressure, because as you produce, the trapped gas in the trapped zone expands. And we found out that if you the reservoir pressure drops significantly as a result of production, some of these gas expands, and the saturation to get 3–4% beyond the trapped gas saturation, the gas mobilizes. And then we monitored that, and we looked at it with the X-ray monitoring to see where is higher saturation in a core that we took preserved in a vertical direction. And so that significant impact on the trapped gas saturation then can be recovered. So then you could pick up zones to study that, whether you could see it in all wells, are they continuous, or they're barriers, or these are very important to characterize at a smaller scale.
Okay, next question. How can we estimate residual saturation index for a 3 to 5 years old shale reservoirs?
Well, I don't know what you mean by 3 to 5 years shale reservoir. Could you explain that?
Oh, it's the question of the Dr. Mahmoud Khani, would you please unmute yourself and answer the question?
Sure. Good afternoon. Good evening, Dr. Honarpour. Thank you so much for the presentation. What I meant with that one is that, usually we get this huge peak oil within first 12 months, and we start seeing that decline starting right after, and of course, then at 3 to 5 years, period after the initial production, this is the time we start, applying all those techniques for artificial lifts, whatever we can. But then this is not enough, and some areas that decline is significantly higher than what we anticipated before, right?
Right.
And what we don't know, the uncertainty that I don't understand, I don't know how to do, is that is there any empirical way that we can estimate how much oil we still have left in these type of formations?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Very good question. As we know, most of the unconventionals, the remaining oil saturation is very close, within a few percent of the original oil saturation. And that depends on the pressure drawdown and heterogeneities in this type of rocks. And I think, there are still some concepts that are not proven. My feeling is that as you draw the pressure down to below the bubble point pressure, and even there are people that showed within a play, there's a lot of variability between API gravity and oil viscosities, and so that exists. I think some of the people in Conoco, they published that. So what happens as the reservoir pressure drops, gas saturation evolves. Gas evolves and then form a gas saturation. But then this is more like an internal gas drive. It's not, you don't inject any gas. So the internal gas drive, first of all, bubble of gas forms in the largest pore. And as you draw down, you want to increase the production, you put more drawdown, these bubbles expand. And then once this bubble mobilizes and form a relative permeability, then basically what you get out of the cores of the rock and the well is really a lot of gas with little oil displacement. So we all are anxious to recover our investment, so we put high drawdown, and then within a year or two, we reach a point that we only basically taking away the reservoir energy, which is gas, and then very little oil displacement takes place. So the industry has accepted this, that they do gas injection. Like EOG, they do a lot of gas injection, very expensive, and then miscible gas injection, and then they get additional recovery of 10, 15% or more. But this is a subject of, first of all, understanding the mechanism of gas and oil displacement in this type of environment. And then secondly, come up with a technique, maybe some improved gas injection in order to get more of the oil out.
Mm-hmm. So sorry, I just unmuted myself. So what we need to do perhaps is to look at the production history and pay attention to the gas changes in the gas, and of course the production as well as the water production, because I don't know, somehow some of the things that we have seen so far recently is that they are mostly water driven rather than gas driven for reservoirs. So
yeah, I mean, some of them, are you referring to Eagle Ford, or are you talking to some of the
Permian
okay.
And Bakken?
Okay, Permian is a little different.
Okay.
Bakken, of course, also it's two different formations. The Permian, there is water production, but we're not sure whether the water is coming from the same zone or layer than the oil is coming from. It's possible that the water is segregated. It has its own channel. It's not displacing the oil, but they are, thin laminated zones that has 100% water saturation. And some people have seen that this water production gradually drops with time. And so has the oil production. So there is a question whether the water production is really responsible for oil production. That's a big question. In a Bakken situation, there is a lot of fractures in these reservoirs, natural fractures, or the hydraulic fracture that connect the main body of Bakken with the, I forgot the name of the zone below it, four something, and
Three Forks.
Sorry about that. I haven't been involved with it for 4 or 5 years, but we found that a lot of the production from a Three Forks influences production from main Bakken. So if you look at the production data, published information, there is interrelation between the two. And sometimes I think they may be segregated flow. that is taking place. Whether the question is always, should we draw water at a high rate? Will it bring more oil or basically trap the oil? So these are the information that needs to be studied. The challenge is lab study for this type of rocks are extremely hard because you really, I did some relative permeability measurement and what the water first go through the rock basically trap the oil, and trapped oil itself reduces permeability significantly. And so there is not it easily. The fracture system works as a network for relative permeability measurement, but the matrix are very challenging to assume regular or conventional way of a displacement process. There is more involved in it. Probably Dr. Firza Abadi can talk about that a little bit more.
Here, Abbas Furzabadi. Hello, Matt. How are you?
Oh, great to see you.
Yeah, I have a question, Matt, relation to a plot you had, SOR versus variability index covering the whole range. I don't know if you can bring it.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, here. Basically, is this a lab measurement or from field data?
I think this is, as you see, USBM is a lab measurement. This is a bunch of cores that were measured in the lab.
But is it the cores recovered from the reservoir or from water flooding?
No, this is whole reservoir that was basically different reservoirs. You could see there's a lot of variation from the, sometimes it doesn't identify the type of cores or any details of it. So I would look at it with a greater salt that if you get a few of that is strongly water wet or a strongly oil wet, then the rest of it, there is no relation, even though neutral wettability is questionable. So this is the old way of.
This is the whole point of my argument, is that somehow I think wettability is mixed up in the literature.
It is not a good way of measuring it. First of all,
but
you're exactly right. You're exactly right.
Basically, there are reservoirs which the wettability varies strongly from, say, water wetting to oil wetting. But the samples, residual oil independent of wettability. Now, here what you're showing also, there is really no systematic effect of wettability, and some people, a lot of argument in the literature is that the more water wetting you do, it's better. To me, actually, this is an indication. Suppose these results are okay. So that means the focus or the statement we are often seeing the relation in their wettability in the literature, that there is somehow preference for water wetting, maybe for basically mobility control, which is different. But for terms of recovery, that emphasis in the literature may not be valid. And to me, this is a demonstration. If we accept that these data are okay, then what we see that there should be no preference in terms of residual oil from water wetting and oil wetting. And again, my point is that what we see a statement in the literature, overwhelming statement in the literature, that maybe water wetting is better, oil wetting, that maybe somehow relates to mobility, but for residual oil, if we go by figure, and there are other evidences that actually maybe that's not relevant. Even if you go to your capillary pressure curve and negative part, there actually we see that. See, if you go to your capillary pressure, you see here, suppose I have a strong water wetting. So that means there is going to be no contribution from negative part of capillary pressure if I have a strong water wetting.
Yes.
But if you have a oil wetting, there's a lot of contribution from the negative part. That means in a large oil column, I prefer to have a oil wet system. So I think that's my comment. I don't know what your observations are.
Well, I've looked at some of the work that is being done in Abu Dhabi. Huge number of imbibition capillary pressure.
In the lab.
And
in the lab.
I'm sorry, I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Right, right.
Yeah, and
that's in the lab. That's in the lab.
Yes, it's a lab measurement.
But it's
and
not
then,
of
course, you know, the residual oil saturation, everybody believes the residual oil saturation from imbibition capillary pressure as the ground truth. But then depends on how the sample is prepared to begin with. And I showed in some of the presentation at SPE forums that really a lot of the data that is after cleaning and restoring, the core does not experience the same wettability that it has. The chances of restoring the wettability is very low as compared to the reservoir. So as a result, the residual oil saturation is questionable.
No, but you know, my point actually even more than that. Suppose you do whatever you establish wettability in the core. If it's on water wetting, the rate doesn't affect the reservoir. But if you make it mixed rate, you can get from imbibition, you can get 5% recovery. But from pore flooding, you can get 50% recovery. So
I see.
I think there's a whole mix of issues and confusion.
Yeah.
So actually, some of them seems to be clear, but my point is that there is overwhelming confusion in the literature that somehow there is a lot of statement on wettability and recovery, especially in the case of water imbibition.
Yeah.
That may not be relevant even. So anyway, I think your evidence, what you showed, if you know we believe the figure shows again the same thing, that you know this emphasis on wettability actually is overblown.
I see. But how would you say about this Seminole formation?
Right.
This is part of it is mainly dolomite. Some of them is limestone. So the question is, certainly you could see the original reservoir, original paleo oil water contact from the way that pattern is at 5540. It's represent a water wet system.
I see in the middle, basically, this variation is not systematic. You see, there is a lot of time changes of wettability with depth. And here, most probably there is, or if there is, but there is no systematic effect of height.
So what it is, I feel that there are some parameters in addition to wettability and heterogeneity that we see at the pore level that we are not capturing.
No, actually there is. See that parameter. I think wettability or interfacial tension for water displacement, they are minor. There may be more important parameter, at least we see in some of the work we have done. One or two are published. The other one will be published, is that the elasticity of the interface may be a key example that we are neglecting, basically.
I mean, I understand. In fact, I read your two papers that you published. Not too many others have studied that. So you're a pioneer in that area. That's what I said. There are some parameters that are missing, and maybe interface elasticity is one of them.
Thanks.
I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. For saving time, I just try to ask two more questions and wrap up the webinar. The next question, how can we design surfactant flooding for heterogeneous shale reservoir?
Okay. Surfactant, of course, you know, there are different types of surfactant, of course. Surfactant is responsible for change in interfacial tension. But surfactant also absorbs on the surface of the clays and all that. So a lot of it is lost in the process before it gets to do its job, reduce interfacial tension. So that is an issue that I think there is almost 50 years that the industry is working on surfactant flooding. And we haven't seen significant improvement in recovery in many reservoirs, except maybe in some of the Chinese publication. That is, and then Professor Firouzabadi has got a different approach to it. But basically, I haven't seen big improvement, even though we do pre-flush, post-flush, a lot of things in order to make sure that is not interacting with the clays. Or and I think, you know, this is very sensitive. I did some of that in the publication, couple of publication that with in Eagle Ford, and we even put a patent in there. But we mixed it with other chemicals, oxidizing chemical, and a combination of that was improved recovery. But you know, in shale, it is not. It has to be combined with something else. By itself, it's going to be a lot of it is absorbed in a conventional surfactant.
And the last question, what do you think of hybrid gas surfactant flooding or puff and puff for unconventional reservoirs?
Huff and puff is something that it has potential. And by huff and puff, you mean gas and then water, or that's WAG? But it's gas and surfactant slug, what you mean? Well, you know, the gas injection overall, it is challenging. The gas injection that is most suitable, the gas has to have very close composition as the oil in order to form miscibility. And then also gas injection generally, if it is different from the being very close to the reservoir fluid, it causes asphaltene dropout. So asphaltene dropout, if you do asphaltene dropout in formation, shale formation, basically you're plugging the formation. So you have to be very careful what type of gas is being injected. You can inject nitrogen or inert gases, but then that is exactly what is causing the asphaltene dropout. So these are some of the things that, you know, it requires a rock fluid close collaboration in order to do this design of it, such test, a laboratory design. And I don't know, the only company that has published, or at least data are available, are EOG, and mainly their work was doing a methane or very lean gas injection. And the recovery, they're talking about 30% or more, but they are going in a more mobile compressors and injectors in order to improve recovery. But I haven't seen mechanism of recovery changing very much.
Thank you so much. I personally have lots of questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time. Once again, I would like to thank Dr. Honarpour for his very interesting presentation and all the participants for taking part in this event. And I hope you have a very great time for the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. If there is any question or something, you can send it to my personal email address, mattquran@yahoo.com. I'd be happy to respond to that if I know.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
All right.
I really appreciate it. Thank you. Have a
Pleasure talking with you guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.